So we're going to welcome to the stage Ankit Jain, who is the CEO and founder of Aviator. So put it together for Ankit.
Today, we will be talking about scaling ownership to improve developer experience. So before we get started, the main thing I would want everyone to get out of this conversation is not even a solution, but like really understanding why ownership is even a problem. And obviously, everyone will have different ways of thinking about it, and I would want to kind of like present many different ideas that we've had discussed with different people, and we'll see kind of like how this resonates with everyone. So let's get started a little bit. Let's see if this guy works. So a little bit my background. I'm a software engineer, previously used to work at Google, and have worked at a bunch of startups. Founder and CEO of a company called Aviator, like the sunglasses. We are building a Google-level engineering productivity suite. So what does that really mean? So we're essentially trying to bring some of the best practices that I've observed myself at Google, bring that to the rest of the engineering in the world. And so ownership. So why is ownership even important? Like, why should we think about it? And this is probably one of the most important things we should really get out of this session. Ownership represents the responsibility of an asset. When we think about development, right? Any kind of code that you're writing, that requires ownership. Operations like DevOps, that requires ownership of services. You're thinking about strategy, you're thinking about compliance, you're thinking about resourcing. In summary, what we're looking at is accountability. So essentially, when things go wrong, who do I call? And this is one thing where ownership becomes important. And especially, we are in Monorepo World. So as your code bases grow, as your teams grow, this is where ownership is very critical for teams to understand. And that's what we will try to dive into. So let's kind of like think a little bit about when we think about ownership, what do people mostly think about? The most obvious idea that comes in mind is code owners. So code owners, I'm guessing many of you are familiar with, it kind of like looks like this, especially if you have a monorepo, it probably looks like 200, 300 lines of similar structure. And you have like different organizations, different teams. How do you kind of like really make sense of it? But before we go into it, one thing I would like to emphasize is ownership is not the same thing as code reviewership. What you looked at in code owners is only a small fractional part of it. When we think about ownership, let's look into where else these things exist today. So we have service catalogs. I don't know how many folks are familiar with here. There's a concept of IDPs, internal developer portals. Backstage is one of the open source one, which many teams adopt. And this is also one place where we try to define ownership. But it doesn't just end there. We have Git history, right? All your Git history, everyone who's doing the commits also represents like who's owning what pieces of code. We have GitHub teams. Again, you're defining ownership here, like which teams define who owns what pieces of code. And we have ownership in a lot of different places, right? We have this ownership information, teams information in Gusto, in your HR tools. You have it in your alerting systems when you define like, OK, this is the PagerDuty escalation policy that I own. There is like a Sentry or Bugsnag or error tracking systems where you own this. You have like Okta where you're again defining who owns what pieces of systems. So all I'm trying to explain here is ownership isn't really just tied to code owners. We're looking at ownership from the perspective of every piece, every asset that the developer has to interact with on a day-to-day basis. And why is it so hard to scale this ownership in large organizations? One of the key challenges is organizations are living, breathing things, right? People change. New people are introduced. You have organic growth. You go from like a 40% company to a 200% company, right? You shift priorities. There are reorgs that happens. People change within the organizations, different teams. And there is a very high probability of people moving within the teams rather than people leaving the company. People move, and ownership becomes much more complicated. So how do we solve this? Before we even solve this, we really have to understand technology doesn't always mirror the org chart. This is how your teams might look like. But that's how your services and systems may look like. They're not really directly tied to one-to-one. So how do we think about really understanding these things? One way to think about it is instead of thinking of individuals, everything should be tied to teams. So essentially, you go from one person owning a service to actually teams owning the service. So you define teams and capture their hierarchy. Because we have the org chart, it makes it easier for you to understand who owns what pieces of code, but also how does this bubble up at different hierarchy levels. And then you define the roles and responsibilities. So once you know how do you represent the teams logically, you can define these responsibilities. And at the last step is when you define the assets. And these assets are now tied to the teams and not to individuals. So what is a software asset? Now, if we go broadly, a software asset is any digital entity that should have an owner. So let's take some examples. All of these things are potentially assets. All of these things are something that developers touch. All of these things are something that should have an owner. So one way to really build a more generic purpose layer to understand assets is you build asset providers. So asset provider could be a team who's managing your database. An asset provider could be a team who's managing your GitHub instance. An asset provider could be your PagerDuty or your on-call system. And then you can group them together. Now you have a different level. Okay, we have a product team which owns now multiple different web applications, and those web applications have a front end and a back end. So you can define that groups and hierarchy and define those relationships. And that would make your asset representation easier for you to manage. And you can define now ownership at different levels. So taking a few original sources, you can now define a single source of truth for ownership. So think about taking your Git history, and in this case, Git history could be your code owners file, and you take your employee data, which is coming from your HR system. Now, the reason we take employee data is because this is the one source of information which is always going to be true. You're not going to have employee data of people who have already left the organization, or you're not going to have employee data of people who don't work at the organization. So taking those things, we define something what we call a team identity. And instead of it being a passive information source, you can inject that information now into all the different systems that require ownership. So instead of having to define these ownerships now in your escalation policies, in your code owners, in your infrastructure, in your service catalogs, you can have a single entity and send all of this information across all different assets, across all the different things that developers touch. Now, why would we want to do that? One way to think about it is, you're taking this information. Now, it's not just an independent team that you have randomly defined. There is a relationship of parent-child. So essentially, if you think about there is first-level managers and it rolls up into different organizations. So each team has a parent-child relationship. And why is that hierarchy important? It's important because when you make this representation of ownership, which teams own which pieces of systems, let's say a reorg happens, a team moves, people move, and the team doesn't exist anymore. You can automatically build a system which actually passes on the responsibility to the parent team. And the advantage here is now your assets are never orphaned. Now you always know who to call when an incident happens. Eventually, sure, that parent team may be a director or a VP level who may have to reassign it to another team. But you always have somebody who takes care of your asset. There's always somebody who's going to take care of who should we call, who's responsible for taking these steps. So let's look at a little bit of examples of what does it mean by managing assets within the team identity. So this team identity now is where you can populate your code owners. So essentially, instead of having a static code owners, now having a single source of truth, now this pipeline pushes any changes in your organization structure directly into your code owners. So if you have a monorepo with 200 lines of code owners file, you don't need to manually manage it. You don't have these zombie teams. You don't have these zombie individuals who own different code paths. And then once they leave the organization, you don't have understanding of who owns what. Likewise, now in test health, you know by different code bases, different code paths, who are the ones who are kind of like managing the test. So especially in a large monorepo, when there's like different test filling at different paths, you can automatically, looking at the stack trace, identify this is the team who is responsible for these tests and kind of automatically assign tickets to them. So you can tie this to Jira, you can tie this to your ticket management system, and fetch all of the test health information from your different systems. Likewise in release management, if you have a lot of different releases going from your monorepos, you can now break it down because you have tied now code paths and assets to these different teams, and you can split them by different services and deploy them independently. I already described a little bit on the bug, on the testing, but this also works in monitoring systems. So kind of like looking at your Sentry data or your error tracking systems, you can automatically track who owns these services and how do we assign these issues to those teams. And likewise, now you can measure, understand productivity. You can measure these DORA metrics, lead time for changes, change failure rates. If you're deploying these services independently, you can track how your delivery performance is in each team and be able to even understand, like, oh, our iOS team and Android teams have differences in how they're deploying, and can we kind of like find where the inefficiencies are and be able to automatically track all of this information without having to manually keep on tracking ownership. And this is just tracking the surface, right? You can start trying to identify ownership drifts. So suddenly, even if the teams exist, maybe they stopped writing code to this. Maybe there are other teams who started contributing to these pieces of code. Can we automatically introduce them into this code base? Can we automatically add them as owners? Can we track technical debt at different levels? Now you can track it, like if you're defining these hierarchies, you can track it like a product level, you can track it a particular platform level, you can track it particular feature level. What is the tech debt? How do we identify this? How do we improve on it? How do we define goals for these organizations? You can track code review bottlenecks, like how are we performing as a team in terms of code review health? Should we have different teams own these different responsibility of how quickly do we respond back to reviews? What is like overall the quality of bugs, quality of code that's written in different pieces of your code, of your team? And you can do that now based on the team level information and be able to collectively, as teams, grow and improve. And that's overall around scaling developer experience. I would love to, again, if you take one thing back from this session, it should be that understanding ownership at an organization level is important, and being able to track different assets is very complicated. And again, it makes, especially as your organization grows, it's living, breathing. You're going to have drifts. You're going to have people leave. You're going to have teams move across different teams. Having a central place of identifying these ownership makes a huge difference in how your teams operate, how your teams really understand inefficiencies within your developer experience, and make it easier for developers to really understand like who owns what pieces of systems, and make it easy for you to go and track them. A quick note on Aviator itself. We as a company started 3 years ago. We help improve engineering productivity at all different stages. There are 4 core products outside of Teams. So Teams, again, what I described here, the product doesn't exist today. This is something that we are working on, but would happy to chat with anyone who's interested in learning more. These are some of the products that we already have that we build and scale with our different organizations. StackPR is a product that helps. It's an open source CLI that you can use to break down your changes into smaller changes, makes it easier for people to review, improves your code review response times because smaller changes have been statistically proven to be faster and easier to review. We have a system called Attention Set, which is inspired again from Google's Gerrit. This is a system that helps you track the changes which require your attention. For instance, as a reviewer, when I respond back to a code change, the attention is passed back to the owner, the author, and when author is creating making changes in their PR and sending back the review back to the reviewer, the attention is passed back to the reviewer. There's also a Chrome extension that helps it easy to track this attention, especially in large repositories and different multiple repositories. You can actually track all of these things together. You might have heard the talk from the other side as well on merge queues. So we do have like a merge queue that works with NX systems. So especially if you have large monorepos, it creates a distributed queue based on your NX graph. And based on your dependencies, you can distribute the queues. And last but not the least, our product, release management, which makes it easy for teams to manage releases, makes it easier for each individual developer to track what changes are going out. This is, again, tied to the dependency graph as well as teams. So if you have a monorepo and you do multiple releases, it identifies what changes are getting targeted and impacted based on the things that you're releasing, and makes it easier for developers to manage releases, cherry picks, rollbacks, all of those things together. So that's it. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions, you can always email me, and check it out, aviator.co/identity. Again, teams and ownership is a place we are actively exploring and learning more. We also run a community. We call it dx.community. It's like NX, but with D. dx.community, which is a place where we learn and talk about many different developer experience topics. Come meet us there. We do virtual sessions as well as in person, working with many different organizations to learn about a developer experience. With that, thank you very much. I don't know whether they're taking questions here, or I'm happy to chat on the side with everyone. Are we taking questions here, or should we just move on the side?
We do have a little bit of time. If somebody has questions, we can do that.
Let me take, yes. I can take the...
Was there any more questions? Yeah, there was. OK.
You mentioned investing in tools to detect drifts between kind of ownership and Git commit history as being a good path. Do you have any open source tools that already exist that you would recommend for starting down that path?
That's a good question. So we do not know directly of tools that do that, but the algorithm itself is pretty straightforward. Like, you essentially look at the last X number of commits, and generally we look at like last 100 commits and identify who are making those commits and seeing whether they're part of the same teams. The reason you want to do commits versus time is because different parts of codebase move at different speed. So you don't want all of them to be, if a library only gets modified twice a year because you have to just do upgrades twice a year, you don't want that be assigned to other people. And also, the other part is many organizations have these libraries and frameworks where they will do horizontal changes, where there is like a platform team who's actually making changes across all different libraries, and they don't necessarily own those libraries as well. Cool. All right. I'm also available on the side, so if you have any questions, happy to chat on the side as well. Good? All right. Thank you so much.